The people who get forced into retirement early almost always had a plan. The plan just never asked what happens if the finish line moves without asking permission.
Here's a number that should bother you more than it probably does. Most people don't retire on the date they picked.
They retire on a date something else picked for them.
I spent the last several weeks in government labor surveys, insurance filings, and retirement. Confidence data, and one pattern kept surfacing. The retirement plan most people build is a plan for
version of their life where nothing interrupts it. No injury, no layoff, no caregiving emergency, no early diagnosis.
That version of your life is not the most likely one. So today I want to walk you through 3 forces that tend to hit at the same time, right around the eggs that most people don't choose, and why the standard advice you've heard 100 times.
Contribute steadily, retire around 65 to 67, trust the withdrawal rate rule, quietly assumes a level of control over your own timeline that the data says you probably won't have.
Let's start with why this feels invisible until it isn't. A retirement projection feels like arithmetic.
Balance, contribution rate, assumed return, target age. Plug it in, get a number, feel settled.
But what that number actually represents is a bet that your health, your employer, the market, and the government will all stay cooperative for the next 15 or 20 years.
History is not kind to that particular bet. Here's the image I keep returning to.
Picture a fuel gauge that's been quietly miscalibrated for years, reading 3 to 5 years fuller than what's actually in the tank. You can't see it from the cockpit. You just trust the needle. Most retirement plans fail the same way, not from bad math, but from a gauge nobody thought to double-check.
Let me make this concrete with someone I'll call Marcus. Marcus was 50. 4 had around $2, 160 zeros, zero saved, and a target date of 60. 6.
On paper, disciplined, on track, nothing alarming. His plan wasn't sloppy, it was actually pretty solid.
At 57, Marcus tore a rotator cuff doing something completely unremarkable, moving furniture for his daughter.
Recovery kept him off the physical side of his job for months. During that stretch, his department got restructured.
He came back to a smaller role and a pay cut he didn't see coming. He adjusted, pushed his date out.
18 months later, a second round of cuts caught him anyway. He was 50. 9, with about a year of expenses saved outside retirement accounts, and penalty, free 401k access still years away.
Was Marcus's plan wrong? No, and that's the uncomfortable part. The math was fine. What was missing was a plan for the version of his life where the timeline wasn't entirely his to set.
Here's the reframe I want you to sit with. This usually isn't described as a savings problem, and it's tempting to treat it that way, but the real gap is a timeline problem.
You can save exactly the right amount for a retirement at 67 and still come up short because you actually stopped working at 61 and nobody built the model around that.
Saving the right amount doesn't help if the finish line arrives on someone else's schedule. The numbers back this up almost uncomfortably well.
A majority of workers, well over half in recent surveys, end up retiring earlier than they intended, and the median actual exit lands around age 60, a few years short of what most people
Plan for. Of those early exits, health issues and job disruptions dominate the reasons. Only about 1 in 5 leave early because they actually chose to, financially ready and on their own terms.
Roughly 11,000 Americans leave the workforce every single day. Most of them didn't set that date on a calendar in advance.
So check your own runway for a second, because the next part changes the dollar figure you actually need to prepare for.
There's a second story worth introducing here, a friend I'll call Alina, 50, 1, roughly $310, 0 saved, targeting 60, 5 with a reasonable, looking path toward $750, 0 by then.
She's thorough. She's done more homework than most people ever will. I'll come back to her math shortly, because it illustrates something important.
But first, the part I'd call the triple squeeze.
three costs that tend to land at almost exactly the moment people actually leave the workforce, and together they explain why a large share of new retirees say they were caught off guard by what
Retirement actually costs. Squeeze 1, the healthcare gap.
That's the stretch between the median actual retirement age of 60, 2, and Medicare eligibility at 60, 5, 3 years with no employer coverage and no Medicare yet.
And going into 2026, this gap got meaningfully more expensive because the temporary boost to marketplace insurance subsidies lapsed and wasn't renewed.
That means the old subsidy cutoff is back in force, and anyone earning above roughly the mid-60 thousands as an individual now pays full freight for coverage, which can run well over $1,000
a month depending on age and region.
Multiply that out and you're looking at somewhere near $12,000 to $13,000 a year in premiums alone, before deductibles, before prescriptions, before a single doctor's visit.
Independent research on retiree health care spending puts lifetime costs for a couple retiring around 65 in the neighborhood of several $100,000, and that figure still excludes long-term care.
Exit 3 years early instead of on schedule, and you're stacking tens of thousands in unplanned premiums directly onto the years when your portfolio is most vulnerable to a bad sequence of return.
Squeeze 2, Social Security timing.
Claim before your full retirement age and your benefit is permanently reduced by as much as 30% if you start at 60, 2 versus waiting until full retirement age, which is 67.
For most people working today, wait until 70 instead, and the benefit is roughly a quarter higher than the full retirement age amount locked in for life.
This isn't a scheduling preference, it's a permanent income decision.
Every year you delay past full retirement age adds a guaranteed increase to your monthly check for the rest of your life. A guarantee no index fund on earth legally offers you.
There's no market return that beats a guaranteed raise for simply waiting. Squeeze 3, the quiet one. Lost years of contributions and compounding. Take someone earning around $120,000, saving 15% a year. 5 fewer working years isn't just the missing contributions. It's what those contributions and the existing balance would have compounded into. On a moderate starting balance, 5 extra years of growth at a typical long-run market return can add several $100,000 by retirement.
Lose those 5 years, and you're not just short on savings, you're short on decades of compounding you'll never get back.
By the way, if this kind of breakdown is useful, hit like on this video. It genuinely helps Novira Invests reach more people who need to see this before it's too late for them to adjust.
So added up, an unplanned health care gap, a permanently reduced Social Security check, and years of lost compounding, stacked on top of each other, arriving in the same 3 to 5 year window.
Usually without warning. Now, about the withdrawal rate, you've probably heard quoted as gospel. Take out 4% a year and you're safe for 30 years.
That figure comes from research going back to the 1990s, tested against nearly a century of market history, and it does hold up reasonably well for a standard 30-year retirement.
But here's what rarely gets mentioned. Even the researcher most associated with that number has said in recent interviews that it may actually be too conservative for a typical 30-year horizon.
The catch is the opposite problem shows up for anyone retiring early. If your retirement stretches to 40 or 50 years instead of 30, most current research suggests something closer to 3 to 3, and 0.5%, not 4.
On a moderate 6-figure portfolio, that difference is thousands of dollars in annual income every single year before you even account for the health care gap or a reduced Social Security check.
And the single riskiest moment for that withdrawal math isn't a mediocre decade of returns, it's a market downturn in the first few years after you stop working.
Pull the same dollar amount out of a portfolio that just dropped 40%, and you're liquidating a much bigger slice of a much smaller pie.
Recent research on retirees who hit poor returns early and didn't adjust their spending shows they were far more likely to run out of money altogether.
Back to Alina, if she exits at 60, not 65, her balance lands closer to $480,000 instead of $750,000 a quarter million dollar gap before she's withdrawn a single dollar.
Add 3 or 4 years of health care premiums she hadn't budgeted for. Add a reduced Social Security check if she claims early out of necessity.
Run a conservative withdrawal rate against the smaller number, and the annual income gap versus her original plan runs into the tens of thousands every year for a 25-year retirement.
Her math wasn't wrong. The assumption baked into the math that she'd reach 65 on schedule under her own control was the actual risk.
The math is rarely the problem. The assumption hiding inside the math usually is. Here's something psychologically interesting buried in all of this.
People are genuinely bad at planning for the version of events where they're not the one steering. We build plans for the world where our choices decide the outcome.
We badly underplan for the world where something external decides for us, and decades of data say that second world is the one most people actually retire into.
One generation is sitting closer to this collision than any other.
Independent retirement research groups have flagged Gen X, roughly those born in the mid-1960s through 1980, as the least prepared generation by several measures.
They came up right as traditional pensions disappeared and 401k-style plans became the default, often without the automatic enrollment features younger workers take for granted now.
Only a small fraction have access to a traditional pension at all, compared to a majority of the generation before them.
Recent surveys show this group expects to retire with several $100,000, less than they believe they'll actually need, the largest self-reported shortfall of any generation surveyed.
And there's a date worth circling.
Recent Social Security trustee projections show the retirement trust fund reserves could be depleted in the early 2030s, a few months sooner than the prior year's projection.
If that happens without legislative action, benefits could face an automatic cut of roughly a fifth.
The oldest members of Gen X hit full retirement age right around that same window. Read that back.
The generation with the smallest pension access, the largest self-reported savings shortfall, and the highest statistical odds of an early, unplanned exit, it is scheduled to reach full retirement age.
In almost the same year, the system might be forced to cut checks. Now, plenty of experienced advisors will tell you Congress always finds a fix before anything breaks, and they're probably right.
They said something similar in past decades too, each time with a little less certainty. Betting on a fix isn't unreasonable.
It's just not the same thing as a strategy. One more update on Alina, because I think closure matters here.
A few months after we talked, she hadn't rebuilt her entire plan. Most people don't, and that's fine.
But she made 2 changes. She raised her contribution enough to fully capture her employer match, which she'd been leaving on the table.
And she opened a separate account she labeled, plainly, Bridge Fund. A few $100s a month, earmarked specifically for the years before Medicare kicks in.
Not a full solution, but proof to herself that she'd actually looked the risk in the eye instead of hoping around it.
So here's what I want you to actually do this week. First, stress test your plan against 60. 2, not 67.
Pull your current balance and ask, if something forced me out at 62, what would my monthly income actually look like using a more conservative withdrawal rate, not the optimistic one?
If you can't answer that in 10 minutes, that's this week's homework, not picking new funds, just running that one number.
Second, build an explicit healthcare line item into your plan before Medicare eligibility, even if it's a rough estimate.
It's the most predictable major expense that almost never shows up in a standard calculator.
Third, treat Social Security claiming age as a financial decision with a guaranteed return attached, not a date you'll figure out later. If your situation allows it, modeling a bridge strategy, living on savings for a few years while your future benefit grows, is worth the spreadsheet time.
If this helped you see your own timeline differently, hit like and subscribe to Novira Invest so you don't miss the next one. I'm building out this whole framework video by video.
Alina still hasn't run her Social Security bridge numbers. I'm working through that with her next. Careful planning has quietly built more wealth than any headline chasing trend ever will.
Check your runway.